because I think that winning that NBA championship was absolutely massive. It was huge for him, and he was integral in it. Was, as you said earlier, he wasn't just a passenger in that team. That third quarter, he came out in the third quarter of Game 5 when they wrap it up 4-1 over Miami Heat for the Spurs. He's hit 14 points on 5 of 5. A couple of threes in there. He's just been terrific, and that broke open the game. Manu Ginobili's on the bench there, taking at a timeout, yelling at the players, we've got him, this is it, we've got to take him right now. And they've gone back out, and Paddy's done it. That euphoria of that moment will never be lost to him, and the joy of winning that NBA championship will never be lost to him. But if we're weighing the two up, I think you find that bronze medal that's sitting in his mum and dad's house is the most important thing, most important accolade from his playing career.
He is the author of Patty Mills Beyond Basketball. We have the pleasure in welcoming Boti Nagy onto Hoopsology. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on. We interview a ton of authors, and I'm very excited just to jump in the origin story of just Patty Mills' life. But before we get into that, we have a bit of a tradition on our show. We talk about basketball culture, what makes the game of basketball so great, why we love it so much. So take this question any way you want it. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
Wow, that's well, look, I think there's an Aboriginal basketball player, the very first Indigenous Australian basketball player athlete to represent Australia at an Olympic Games, a man by the name of Michael Ahmat. And when I was growing up, he was already a star, and my older brothers were all star basketballers here in South Australia. And there was a grand final, and I come from a Hungarian background, and the team that I supported that my brothers played on was Budapest, which is named after the capital city of Hungary, and they were playing South Adelaide, for whom Michael Ahmat played. And Michael had been, I was about 7, and he'd been already very kind to me and just a lovely man generally. Before the grand final, the big match, Budapest versus South Adelaide, he came up to me and he said, "So, who are you barracking for?" And it was a really awkward question for a 7-year-old to kind of deal with, because he was Michael, who I adored, and then my brothers were playing. So I came up with what I thought was a pretty intelligent answer for at the time. I said, "Well, I'm hoping my Budapest wins, but that you have a very good game." And he was very happy with that. He muscled my hair a bit and wandered off. And that's my fondest. I think that's my fondest memory of it all. Right back there, South Adelaide did win that game. And Michael played fantastically, and then he went on to, as I say, this was before he became the first Indigenous athlete to represent Australia at Olympic Games. So he's quite a famous man in our country.
Can you take our audience, just to give our audience context into this Patty Mills' journey throughout his professional career? What is the basketball culture like in Australia? Can you kind of compare it to the rest of the world in terms of how Australia relates to the game of basketball in terms of popularity, and it's in terms of culture as well?
Its popularity now is probably at an all-time high, but it has really struggled over time, because the big sports in Australia are Australian rules football, and that's in half the country, and the other half of the country play NRL, which is National Rugby League. So the majority of our male athletes gravitate to those sports where you can be paid $1 million, and those are the sports that take away our greatest athletes. And the same in women, we have netball, and that takes away the majority of our female athletes. And like rugby and Aussie rules, which is probably a spin-off of it, these are things that we got from England, from the colonial background of this country. And so an American-based sport like basketball had a lot of difficulty getting entrenched in the general psyche, because, as I say, all our great athletes first gravitate towards the sports where they're going to get instant notoriety, instant fame, instant money. And so it's not that we haven't got the best of the athletes, because now they are drawn to basketball. Now that basketball particularly has opened up a way into the NBA and the WNBA, a lot of our younger athletes now are going, "No, I want to play this sport." And so basically, over the last 20 years. Actually, probably go a little further back than that, back to Luke Longley winning 3 championships with the Chicago Bulls with that phenomenal team with Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman and Tony Kukoc. I could go on, that great team. That was really when basketball started to get very interesting in this country, mid to late 90s. And then this century, it's been experiencing a steady rise because we've got guys like Josh Giddey and Dyson Daniels running around in the NBA, Jock Landale. There's quite a number of them, and young men now can see, and young women can now see that, that's a path to a pretty interesting sporting future. We can not play football or not play rugby. We can actually get somewhere doing that. So the growth of the game now, I'm not sure if you're aware, Justin, but we just had the New Orleans Pelicans out here.
Yes.
Playing a couple of games, and they beat probably our best team at the moment, Melbourne United. They beat them by 10. And then they played Southeast Melbourne, who they had less difficulty with. But it was sort of fantastic and absolute sellout crowds, and just the whole experience for the NBA teams, or the NBA team was so good. Zion Williamson had such a good time. These guys really enjoyed themselves out here because our culture is now embracing basketball. It's still not what you'd call a major sport, but it's definitely got its own eyes now. Lots of people are coming to it.
So for Patty Mills, who won an NBA championship, he led the Australian men's team. He also won an Olympic medal, bronze at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. Can you explain in terms of the popularity of the game in regards to Patty Mills's journey and your research in terms of kind of his love for the game, take our audience through that to his path to the NBA? Because I think for hardcore basketball fans, especially for the Spurs teams, I mean, he was very integral. I know Tim Duncan and Ginobili and Tony Parker gets a lot of the credit, but, Patty Mills was a key member of that team as well. So can you kind of take kind of our audience through this Patty Mills' origin story and your research in compiling that?
Well, really, it's a quite an amazing story because, as I mentioned, Michael Ahmat was the first Indigenous first Indigenous player in the Olympics, but certainly he was the basketball player in the Tokyo Olympics of 1964. Now, sometime after that, he goes up to Townsville, which is on the other side of the country, north, the tropical area, and he takes some basketball clinics up there with all the young kids. And one of these young kids is a man named Danny Morseu, who is going to play rugby league, but he gets exposed to basketball by Michael Ahmat, falls in love with it. He becomes a basketball player. He goes to 2 Olympics. He's an Indigenous player as well. He goes to 2 Olympics. He's an uncle of a young man named Patty Mills. And so Patty Mills then takes us to a medal in Tokyo. So it starts in Tokyo with Michael, it goes through Danny, who goes to 2 Olympics, and then sort of concludes with Patty at his 4th Olympics. He's now been to 5, getting us a medal. So Patty was only 12 years old and into basketball. His mother and father were based in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, and he played for a team that they organised, or a club they organised called Shadows, which was basically for Indigenous players, and it did very well in Canberra, and that was his first exposure. But he was also playing Aussie rules football, and then he was 12 when the Sydney Olympics were on in 2000, and he got to watch the Australian team get to a bronze medal playoff, even though they didn't win, but they got there. But the thing that inspired him the most was a woman by the name of Kathy Freeman, an Aboriginal runner who won the 400 meters gold, and she was just, she was the world champion at that time, so she was carrying basically the nation of Australia on her shoulders when she ran that race. So how she won it was quite extraordinary, because when she comes into the straight, she looks like she's running on empty. She's got so much that she's carrying, but she gets there and she crosses the line and she wins, and she's fantastic. Patty sees that and goes, I want to play it. I want to be an Olympian. She inspired him. And then there's the basketball team that's getting to a bronze medal playoff, unsuccessful for the 3rd time. And it's like, okay, that's where it all starts to make sense to Patty. He's going to play basketball, even though the Sydney Swans, which is an Australian Football League team and one of the more prominent ones in Australia, they were looking at him. He was already playing football and basketball at the same time, and they could see he might be a terrific footballer. So he had some decisions to make. And then there was another young man named Scott Pendlebury, who was a Victorian country junior, who got the scholarship to the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra, and he decided he wanted to play football instead. So he left, and that meant there was a scholarship available, and that's the one that Paddy got. They gave that to Paddy, and then he's got his foot in the door with basketball, and that's where it begins. He becomes a very good player at the Australian Institute of Sport. He starts to be selected for Australian junior teams. He does very well at international tournaments and catches the eye of American scouts, and then is recruited to St. Mary's in Moraga in California, where ultimately his uniform is retired. So you can tell what sort of impact he had there. He's just such a tenacious, I mean, he's not a big man. He's only, they say he's 6'1" or 2. I think if he's over 6 foot, he's wearing high heels. But he's just so quick and tenacious and such a terrific sportsman, and so he made a huge impact there. And then on it goes. He's suddenly playing for the Australian senior team. He's now on the fringe of the NBA. His journey is well on its way. But the interesting thing about Paddy that I found when I was doing the book is that he's never forgotten where he comes from, what his background is, and it's a background that you could understand if he had a chip on his shoulder, or if he was a bitter human being, because his mother, Yvonne, who is one of the most delightful people, Justin, that I've ever had a chance to meet in my life. She's just the sweetest person. She is the daughter of a white man and an Aboriginal woman, right? And they separated when she was still just a toddler. And we had a thing in this country where the government thought it would be better to take, you're not going to believe this if you haven't heard it before, but to take children from these Aboriginal parents and put them into white environments so that they could be raised, and have more opportunities in life than what black people were getting in this country, because they really were considered, second-rate human beings, which is just a terrible thing when you even think about, because of its skin color base. It's got nothing based on nothing else. Anyway, so these kids that was taken from their parents and put into white families are known as the stolen generation, and rightly so. And so his mother was part of the stolen generation. As a 2-year-old, she was taken away from her mother because she'd split from her white husband, and he was taken from her, and she was taken from her mum and put into a white society to grow up there, where you don't, you just have to look in a mirror to know that you don't fit in quite as comfortably as other white people do. And now you're out of your black environment, and you're not allowed to sort of embrace your own history or your own tradition or your own culture. So that's a situation that she was brought up in. And then she married Benny Mills, who's a Thursday Island Indigenous person, and they've had Paddy. And later in her life, just quickly finishing with Yvonne, she managed to track down her mother, and it was it was a joyous thing. Of course, she and her siblings, they were all taken away. So now, when you come from that sort of background, you could be bitter, you could be angry, and no one would blame you for it. And no one with any kind of passion or compassion would blame you for it. But she is the sweetest, most generous person, that I've ever met. And Benny is a guy with a great sense of humor, likes to laugh. And so they've raised Paddy to be a humble, just a guy that is grateful for what opportunities he's had. He's taken them, he's made the opportunities for himself, but they raised him in such a manner that he's an ideal role model as a human being.
No, that's an incredible story. And to that point, I'm wondering, with Paddy choosing, basketball, at least in America, a predominantly African American dominated sport, did he encounter any type of issues in terms of, you mentioned he's a two-sport athlete. Did he encounter any challenges on the racial side of things for, participating in basketball during that time in Australia?
in Australia for sure. He was he confronted that all the time, but his game spoke louder, and his teammates obviously appreciated him, so they were there for him. He probably is, unfortunately for our society, he probably experienced more of that than he did in yours, which is probably interesting for someone that would think, well, we're quite racist here in the US as well, but he didn't. The thing about Paddy is, if you asked him, like, where are you from? Because you look black, but you don't look like the sort of black that we're used to seeing. He would happily sit down and share his culture with you, tell you where he's from. I mean, and he's very much embraced his culture. And as he become richer through his successes in the NBA, he's spent a lot of money looking after Indigenous kids in this country, creating situations where water can be piped to those remote areas where Aboriginals live, where they don't have fresh running water. He spends a lot of his money doing very charitable work for Indigenous people. So whatever he cops from a racist point of view, I think that these days is probably non-existent or not, not very prevalent in his life. But he would have received more racism in Australia than the USA, which I think will surprise some people.
No, that's very enlightening. You saying that, and it seems like he takes pride, just within just what Australia means to him. I'm wondering, in comparing just the medal that he won in the Tokyo Games compared to the NBA championship. It may be an unfair question, but do you know what he values more? Do you value equally, just in terms of his career? Like in kind of that context, in terms of you reached the pinnacle of just the basketball world with winning the title with the Spurs, but yet the Olympics is such a global game as well. I think it depends on which athlete you ask in terms of, which accomplishment means more. So I'm just curious in Patty's case, what kind of those accomplishments, where does he rank those two, you think?
Okay, the interesting part of that question is that a lot of the American basketball players who have come to Australia as imports and then decided to stay and then get naturalised, and then we have had a number of them, starting with Cal Bruton, and there's a whole bunch of them over different World Cups and Olympics that have been naturalised and have played for Australia. But the common theme when you talk to any of them, like Darnell Mee, who played for the Denver Nuggets back in the era of the finger-pointing big center. I can't remember his name.
Timbe Mutombo.
That's it, yeah. Back in that particular era where they knocked out Seattle, where the 8th seed beat the first seed. He was part of that. Now, Darnell came to Australia and was a huge success in Australia, became Australian, and then they wanted him to play for the national team. And I had an interview with him where he was saying, if you're a kid growing up in the United States and you play basketball, your goal is to be in the NBA. That's your goal. You don't think about playing for the USA in some tournament somewhere in the rest of the world where that probably most of America doesn't care about. You want to get to the NBA. In contrast, in Australia, when you take up basketball, what you want to do is represent your country at an Olympic Games. Okay, so that's the point of difference that Darnell was making. So it was never that important for him to represent the USA, which he never would have done anyway, or to represent Australia. It was far more important to get to the NBA. So now to your question, Patty Mills is an Australian, and I would bet my bottom dollar that bronze medal that he got at the Tokyo Olympic Games, that he led Australia to with a 42.9 assist game in the bronze medal game, one of the more outstanding individual performances we've ever seen at an Olympics. And by the way, the highest score by any player in an Olympics finals ever. It was, I think that would probably mean more to him in 2020 or 2021 when it happened than 2014. Because I think that winning that NBA championship was absolutely massive, was huge for him, and he was integral in it. As you said earlier, he wasn't just a passenger on that team. That third quarter, he came out in the third quarter of Game 5 when they wrap it up 4-1 over Miami Heat for the Spurs. He's hit 14 points on 5 of 5, a couple of threes in there. He's just been terrific, and that broke open the game. Manu Ginobili's on the bench there, taking it at a timeout, yelling at the players, we've got him, this is it, we've got to take him right now. And they've gone back out and Paddy's done it. Now, that euphoria of that moment will never be lost to him. And the joy of winning that NBA championship will never be lost to him. But if we're weighing the two up, I think you find that bronze medal that's sitting in his mum and dad's house is the most important thing, most important accolade from his playing career.
Was there anything that surprised you in your research and compiling this book? You're very well versed in terms of the history of the sport in Australia, but was there anything that you had expectations prior to writing the book? And then when the finished product became complete, you're like, hey, I didn't realize that maybe the book was going in this direction. Was there anything that kind of surprised you about learning more about Patty Mills' life and compiling for this book?
Absolutely, Justin. The reason it's called Patty Mills Beyond Basketball is because of all the other things that I actually found out about him, his backstory, like the backstory I gave you of his mother, and then his great uncle was a man named Eddie Mabo, who changed land rights situations in Australia, with a landmark court hearing. What had happened in our history here in Australia is that if when the Europeans came here, basically they said if you can't show that you own the land, then it becomes Crown land. It belongs to England or the government or whatever it is. But so basically they because there was no paperwork involved with Indigenous people, they didn't have leases saying yes, I live here and this is my house. Therefore, everything was just deemed to be Crown land. So basically, the Indigenous population were strangers in their own land or didn't know anything in their own land. And so Eddie thought, as many believe, this was wrong. And he basically took on the government and was able to show that, okay, we didn't have paperwork that said that we own this, but here, come to my island in the Thursday Islands, and here you can see generations of grave sites going back hundreds of years of people that have, from my family, that have lived here. So surely this is our land. And that was the principle, the basic principle on which land rights changed. Now, the reason that is important is not just because he's Paddy Mills' great uncle and he significantly changed the law in Australia, but because ahead of that 2014 NBA championship, San Antonio Spurs coach Greg Popovich comes out to greet his team at a team meeting just ahead of playing Miami Heat. He says, do you guys know what today is? And there's a photograph being shown of Eddie Mabo, right? And everyone's looking at it. And of course, Paddy's suddenly choked up. He knows who his great uncle is. And Aaron Baines, the other Australian on that team, is also from North Queensland, which is where the Thursday Islands are, a little bit further up. He knew, and he said it's Mabo Day in Australia, which is June the 3rd. And that was the day that the actual land rights decision was brought down by the High Court and things changed. So that sort of story and the impact, and the fact that Greg Popovich, because he had 9 of his 15 players in that Spurs team were foreign players, people who had come from elsewhere. So he loved sharing their stories so that there was a sense of community within that team, community with the emphasis on the last couple of syllables, unity. And he used that as motivation for this championship series. Not that they needed that much, given that they'd lost the year before, but to tie that in, to find that out, was just absolutely fascinating for me. And similarly to the story I told you earlier, where Michael Ahmat goes to Townsville and coaches a little kid called Danny Morseu, who is Paddy's uncle, who goes to 2 Olympics. And then Paddy tries to emulate him. Actually, he maybe overshot. He got 5 Olympics, whereas Danny got 2. And sort of the full circle moment in Tokyo. When these things happen to you or when you recognize them from your research as a writer, you go, this is gold. How can this be? This is just too perfect. It's almost like a script writer's written something and you go, surely not. Surely there's not that sort of connections. But they are. All of those connections that I saw in putting it together just fascinated me. And I hopefully catch the reader as well.
No, I think that's completely true. And that story you told about Popovich, I think really embodies why players love him so much because I think he has a reputation, I think, for fans through being not the friendliness, but the players that played under him have such a dying loyalty to him. And I
Oh
think
yeah.
it's that story you reference is because of that. And that's really cool to hear about Popovich and Patty Mills' uncle. Quite incredible. One last question for you before we say goodbye. In terms of somebody who picks up this book, when they finish reading it, what is kind of the prolonging message that you want them to have imprinted in their mind when they finish reading it?
Honestly, it's nothing to do with basketball in the end. I mean, it's a basketball player's story, but really it's about tolerance, acceptance, understanding, and recognizing that we're all part of the same world. I think if you come away with that, then I've achieved my goal as a writer, even though that wasn't my intention when I started writing. I was just writing a tribute book for Paddy about his life, and I did not really realize it was going to go the way it did. But if you say, Justin, what do you want to take away from that? I want to take away from the fact that we are all brothers and sisters on one planet.
No, it's true. And I think with sports, it's a universal language. I don't know if you're aware of Lee Ellis. He travels all over the world. He's a podcaster here. He's from Australia. And he plays basketball all over the world, doesn't speak, I think he only speaks English, but yet he also speaks the language of basketball. And he
Yeah.
plays all across the world, and everybody has a good time. And I think that's just a unifying thing. Like we're all humans and we can be unified. And I think that's a great thing in terms of just telling Patty Mills' story and the power of sports as well. So, especially in these times, I hope that sport still carries on because I think it's vitally important,
Yeah.
especially everywhere. Thank you very much for joining us. Truly appreciate it. Can you let our audience know where they can find your work, if you're available on social media, any podcasts, any other projects you're working on as well?
Yeah, I'm available on X. It's BOTI with underscore 28. I've got my own website, which is botinaj.com, BOTINAGY.com. It's called Basketball on the Internet, which very cleverly is BOTI. Well, maybe not so cleverly. And I do a couple of podcasts, one with Joey Wright, who's originally from the US and coached out here in our National Basketball League. That one's called Timeout No Flop Zone. You can find that on YouTube, where we talk about it's a half-hour podcast. We try to keep it to a half hour, and we talk about NBL, NBA, Olympics, basketball generally. But that's a very male-orientated one. And then there's another one I do with a gentleman called Brad Rosen called the Brad and Boti podcast, which you can find on all your usual sources. And there we talk about, we're more specific to the NBL, the Australian competition, and the WNBL, the women's comp. So if you're looking for any information on those, come out every week. The Brad and Boti's out on Wednesdays and Timeout No Flop Zone on Thursdays.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the time. Truly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
An absolute pleasure.